Hello, and welcome to what is the first in a series of videos dedicated to investigative interviewing. Whether you are a police officer, an attorney, an auditor, a journalist, an accountant, a risk professional, or any of a number of other professions, anyone that's beset with getting information from a human in an investigative capacity, this series of videos is for you. Note that the human is definitely the most dynamic and rich source of information that there is. And so we want to make sure we have a good understanding of how to do that. There is a science and an art to it. About me, why should you trust me to teach you about investigative interviewing? Well, I am a licensed private investigator and attorney here in California, and I've performed many thousands of interviews in the public and private sectors over a period of decades. And I've also written a book that's in its 24th year of publication. I've covered everything from very small matters to very large, complex ones across many different legal theories and other issues. The purpose of these videos is really to provide efficient coverage of the basics and fundamentals. I find that I often need a refresher, and I like to have them in a succinct form, something that I can go back and review. And for those of you who are starting out, this is a great place to launch from, a great primer. The form of the presentation I felt was best done in audiovisual format rather than written form. There's certain things that come across in my voice, inflections and so forth, I think that are better suited for what is itself an audiovisual kind of endeavor, which is investigative interviewing. So I felt that was best. What we don't cover is some peripheral issues that are kind of their own verticals, their own buckets, if you will. My book does cover interviewing and deception, which we will get into later. But the book covers eyewitness evidence and interrogation. Those right now are things I don't lend themselves as much to a condensed video presentation. That may change later, but for now we're leaving eyewitness evidence and interrogation out of the mix. As well, we don't tell you how to write a report or how to communicate your findings. In this video, we're going to cover 4 topics. First is a definition for the investigative interview. The next is, how do you go about acquiring skills to become an effective investigative interviewer? Next, we'll discuss some relevant legal issues, and finally, we'll finish with communications theory. The definition of an investigative interview is intuitively the process of seeking, obtaining, and evaluating information from someone with knowledge of circumstances or events. You can pick your own words, but I think this covers it very nicely. There are 2 primary ways to attain effective investigative interviewing skills. The first is academic. These videos are one approach. However, oftentimes the academic approach to interviewing does depend on your role. If you're a police officer or an auditor or journalist, how you learn to do investigative interviewing might be nuanced there. However, once you have built that up, you should then try to find a seasoned investigative interviewer and learn from them. A good one. Remember, practice makes permanent. It does not make perfect. How does a person start the interview? What kind of questions do they ask? How do they control the interview and end it? How do they report their findings? These are all important matters. Covering all potential legal issues is beyond the scope of this video. In fact, it will be necessary for you to reach out to an appropriate legal professional, such as an attorney, to determine what legal issues may be relevant and or whether the following things I'm going to present here are relevant to you or not. The ones I tend to find as potentially an issue are starting here with privacy and confidentiality. There are privacy laws that have come up in the last 5 or 10 years that require you to get consent or special justification for certain types of information, whether it's from a record or a database or from a person. So you want to make sure that you're allowed to have that information, that you have the right to do so. As well, what can you ask? What can you record? And what can you communicate to others? Those are potential issues you want to consider, as well as confidentiality. If you're discussing a confidential topic, make sure that only people who have a need to know are involved, and that there's no one can overhear what you're saying. And then, of course, when you report that out to third parties, that it's done so appropriately. Workplace investigations is also definitely a special category. These are often replete with very complex legal issues and often require special training. These typically involve state or federal disability, discrimination, or retaliation laws. And there's one particular nuance that if an attorney is doing the investigation, that they communicate the person they're talking to, the subject, that they are not their attorney. Typically, the attorney is hired to do an investigation for a third party or for an enterprise, and the person who's being interviewed might believe that that person, because they're an attorney, is their attorney, and that the attorney-client privilege applies when it does not. That's called an upjohn warning. False imprisonment is also very subjective and contextual. If a person does not feel free to leave in a sufficient amount of to a sufficient amount, they might be able to sue you for false imprisonment. So obviously, if you're in a room, maybe don't stand in front of the door, or put them in the corner of a room where they don't feel free to leave. Again, very subjective and contextual, but this is something I do see come up from time to time. Defamation is a case where you say something that you purport to be a fact that is not true. The elements are that roughly a false statement purporting to be a fact, not an opinion, negligently or intentionally published or communicated to a third person that causes damage. So, for example, if I say Paul Sterrett is a criminal when I'm not, and some third person hears that and that causes damage, then I have a case for defamation. Or if I say Paul Sterrett has some horrible disease when I do not, it's not a fact, then that is also defamation. Just be careful what you say and what you report as far as conclusions of fact that are not true. Definitely steer away from making accusations and so forth. Just be careful about that. Last is the Miranda warning, which is for law enforcement and government officials if it's a custodial environment where they do not feel free to leave, or and they are also in an interrogative setting which is likely to induce an incriminating response, then that may require the ability or the requirement to read the Miranda warning. So that's basically the topics I find up that come up the most often. Again, check with your relevant legal professionals as needed. Communications theory is the approach to getting information from humans, a very complex and dynamic source of information. The first of these issues is lost information. Think of this as information that is lost between two people. If I say something to you, we assume that there's some information that's lost during that process. When you return that a statement back to me, there's something that's lost in communication. We'll talk about how to deal with that in the interview video that follows this one. Distraction is also a major issue when it comes to communication. Things involving noise or extreme temperatures or visual distractions, these are all things that, as we know, affect our ability to communicate and can break down the information transfer process. Emotional distress, for example, where you may have a lack of physical or mental relaxation, this can cause you or the other person to exaggerate or overgeneralize the message you're receiving. So try to accommodate these issues. Make sure that there's no undue noise, extreme temperatures. If the person is not in a relaxed state, try to accommodate those to facilitate the process. Internal stress can also be a barrier to effective communication. This includes things like sleeplessness or ill health, sensory deprivation, mood variations, or being under the influence of a legal or illegal drug. All of these can have an impact. You may want to inquire about these issues ahead of the interview if you think it's necessary to do so or appropriate, and then accommodate for them. Ignorance in the communication medium merely considers things like language and dialects. These might, of course, you might have to have a translator in the obvious case, or just make sure that the terms that you're hearing and the ones that you're using are properly accounted for, that you understand what's going on. Also consider the person's education level. Don't use big words. Or if you're in a particular domain that has technical terms, don't use shop talk. Or if you hear this from somebody, make sure that you understand what it is and parse it out and detail it appropriately. This can also include cultural lingo and other similar such things. There's also the unstated assumption, which considers catchphrases and ready-made opinions that make some sort of assumption about an underlying fact, such as, we all know so-and-so did it, but we're looking into this case anyway, or people in this category are always this, that, or the other, so we're going to assume various things about them. Obviously, those are extreme cases, but anytime you make a statement that's a catchphrase or some sort of opinion that leads to some sort of untrue factual conclusion or assertion, that's obviously not good. We all know what the attention span is, and we all have one. What can affect the communication process, of course, is where this breaks. Be sure that you don't speak too slowly or too quickly. Also, believe it or not, there are things called schemas. Two of those are called roles and stereotypes. People tend to categorize others and themselves into these roles and stereotypes, in part to be able to help them organize their existence and to place others into their functional place in society. Roles can include parent-child, spouse, employer-employee, can even consider things like economics, religion, and similar topics. If one is placed into a room with various people, they tend to interact differently with them depending on how they define their role and stereotype. These are again examples of schemas, these unconscious beliefs and sentiments that we harbor to help us interact and make sense of the world. When dealing with communications theory in humans, we really cannot leave the topic without discussing age issues on some level. Of course, there's no stereotype or one size fits all, but there are some things I think we can cover safely. In the case of children, initially you might have to consider whether or not there is trauma involved, emotional trauma. If there is, oftentimes it's going to require a trained specialist. Often it's a psychologist who knows how to probe a child's mind for issues involving a traumatic event. Other things, though, that we generally know intuitively are things like, does the child know right from wrong and the truth? You might want to ask the child, is it wrong to steal a cookie, and get some sort of sense of their capabilities here. Reality versus fantasy, often those are interchanged, especially in a child who's experienced trauma. They will escape to a place of fantasy to avoid having to face the traumatizing event. Observation skills of children are often a little bit underdeveloped. Things around distance in time and space may have little meaning. So you want to drill down and make sure that what you're getting is empirical and factual and objectively sound. In the interview setting, it should be familiar and comfortable. The presence of toys or familiar objects might help. Be sure that when speaking to a child, you're speaking at eye level so that they don't perceive you as being overbearing. It's easier to relate to a child that way. Leading questions are particularly bothersome with children. Leading questions are, of course, those questions that suggest an answer, like you're the person who committed the crime, aren't you? Or anything like that. This may cause the child to answer in an untruthful way, or more seriously, to adopt their answer as something that is actually true. Some children are engaged in a protective instinct. They may feel compelled to protect their abuser. The abuser may have exerted control over them, and this person then goes to a state of survival mode. So just be aware that that may be in play as well. Moving up the age group to adolescence, we've all been there. We're going through physical, emotional, and social growth, and this may be posing challenges. Often, as I recall, peer pressure. You have a special affinity for your peers. You may want to protect them, and that may cause you to, or your adolescent that you're interviewing, to not be as forthcoming or truthful as they might be otherwise. Gang involvement attenuates this, in particular because oftentimes it involves crimes, and the bonds are that much tighter, and so the cooperation and truthfulness may suffer. The adolescents are often have a suspicion of authority, and so again, really the key here is to build rapport. That is the key that I found, and with other educational and training that I've seen, this is the way to get around this particular issue. Often, if you're going to see issues with adolescents, it's going to be in these categories. Some adolescents have a history of abuse and may be reluctant to open up. And so the idea, again, is to gain their trust and to open up in a refined and trusting way. And again, the rapport is key. Adults, very quick topic, no two are alike. Generally, most adults have an investment in the community and will be fully cooperative. Where non-cooperation happens, it tends to involve people who have had prior gang affiliation or been in prison. If you see issues, this is maybe where you find it. With the elderly, of course, no one size fits all. The capabilities are very broad, but there are issues related to aging, such as memory, in particular short-term memory, and the ability to relate events. This group is typically, there's a higher rate of exploitation and abuse, and they may have difficulty in assisting. Well, that's it. We've just completed the first in a series of videos dedicated to investigative interviewing. I hope you found this to be helpful and informative. This will form a strong basis for our next video, which will be on the interview itself. We've covered a lot here, everything from the definition of an investigative interview to how to acquire skills. We looked at some legal issues, and we spent a fair amount of time on communications theory, which is really the tool set for getting information from people. We will also, after the interview video, we'll get into deception, and from there, we'll see. Thank you. If you need more information about me, my contact information, just go to investigativeinterviewing.com. Thank you.